I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guests today are Doctors Edgard Francisco Danielsen and Grégoire Pierre, psychoanalysts practicing in New York City and the hosts of the podcast Discussions on Psychoanalysis. For more, you can visit their websites, edgarddanielsen.com, that's EdgardDanielsen.com, Grégoire Pierre at NewYorkPsychoanalyst.com, that's NEWYORK-psychoanalyst.com. And be sure to follow their podcast, Discussions on Psychoanalysis, available at SoundCloud, Twitter, Facebook, iTunes, and podcast streaming platforms. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. As with all Rendering Unconscious podcast episodes, there is a video accompanying this episode at YouTube. Just visit Trapart Film's YouTube channel, that's TRAPART Film at YouTube, or search for Rendering Unconscious Podcast. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast's main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books 2019. For more information, you can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA23CARL. Your support is very appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious Podcast and all of my other creative endeavors. Well, welcome. And my first question is, why did you all decide to start your podcast?
Oh, well, I will defer to Grégoire on this because then our podcast is it's Grégoire's child. So
we might say it this way. Why? Well, I guess it started as the thought came up when we were having peer group meetings. Edgar and Tina and Peters and myself. Edgar and Tina can be heard in one of the podcasts, the one on racism, the first one on racism. And well, I thought that they might be content for enough to share, but then it wasn't clear how to do that. And we're talking about probably 2015, 2016. And well, eventually I realized that creating a podcast was possible and not so difficult technically. And well, then Edgar decided to come along, and I wanted to share with people outside of our community or within, if they wanted to, a different perception of psychoanalysis. When Edgar and I started talking about what we wanted to do, Edgar, I'm going to speak for you, Edgar. Edgar came up
Thank
with.
you.
You're very
I
welcome.
will add something.
Oh, you will. I'm sure you will.
I will.
Anyway,
Yes.
he mentioned that, and that's really the core of discussions on psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis doesn't work that way. Meaning, and especially for me, being very tired of going to some conferences or participate in a class and listen to people who display the practice that seems so far from my experience of it. And in general, I would say, and also from my experience as someone who has been trained and who practiced for some years in France, and how you could really change the narrative around what it means to be in a room with a patient, in a room or through a screen, as we are doing now a lot of the time. But the inner experience, the difficulty of it, how we don't really know exactly what we do, what to attach ourselves to. Do we only refer to psychoanalytic theories? Do we try to only refer to one psychoanalytic theory? Do we refer to etc.? And I wanted us, Edgar and myself, to share the struggle, I guess, and to also show how psychoanalysis could be thought and practiced differently, also from a cultural place, knowing that in France, even if it's not a clear cut, you will have, I think, a fundamentally different understanding of psychoanalysis in terms of legitimate discourse.
I would like to add a couple of things. One is that Grégoire mentioned the peer group. Just to give us some context there, when we began our training as psychoanalysts, we listened to an instructor saying something like, I've been in a peer group for 35 years or so, he said. And I would like to invite you to explore that as well. So that night we began the conversations, and we came together, four of us, four candidates. And what was fascinating about the group is that, for example, our colleague Tina Paul is from Germany, Grégoire is from France, I am from Puerto Rico, and our colleague Peter was born and raised in the United States. So we came three different languages, four different cultural backgrounds, and as we met on a monthly basis, we realized that we have very rich discussions that would look at psychoanalysis from different lenses, through different lenses, including the cultural one. So one thing that, in fact, happens in our podcast is that Grégoire and I are able to talk from a different perspective in the sense not only of our theories or frames, psychoanalytic frames, but also that we come from different cultural settings. For example, just to give an example, I come from Puerto Rico, which is a colony of the United States, and therefore a lot of my own understanding, I have to deconstruct that because it has been through the colonized experience. While Grégoire, coming from France, as you can imagine. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
Not a colony.
But
it had colonies which influenced the culture too.
So our discussions usually bring something of this flavor of our differences. So the podcast is a celebration of our differences, and trying to understand in what ways we can bridge from one place to another, from one location, internal location, to another internal location. So I just wanted to give that context about the peer group, because it allowed us to create a rich space for discussions and disagreements. Yeah.
No, I love your podcast, and I love the back and forth that you have and how you bounce ideas off of one another, and that you also talk about not just theory, but you often bring in like kind of case examples or examples of something that happened during your day or in a session or something, and really help to bring kind of the content to life in that way.
Yeah, we try to do that, but we have to balance sharing specific clinical information and our patients' privacy. That's something, and our privacy too. That's something we are very attentive to. Make sure that we never, that whatever we talk about clinically is really not something people could be identified with.
It's very vague. That's where the editing comes in.
Yes.
Yeah, you can talk freely, and then you're like, no, not this, not this.
Not this, not this. Now, the one important detail that I think we're still struggling with this, Grégoire. Since the beginning, we were pondering who is our audience.
Yeah, we don't know.
We don't know.
We don't struggle. We just don't know.
we don't know. Well, that's true. We don't struggle. We realize that we don't know. And initially, we were thinking, should we address this to clinicians? Are we addressing people who are not clinicians but are interested in psychoanalysis or mental health in general? Who are those who would like to or literally listen to us? We don't know. We don't know. And throughout the years, we have tried to gauge through different in different ways who is listening to us, and up to this moment, we don't know.
We know people who subscribe to the forum, but it's
yes.
Go ahead. Oh, you thank you.
Yes.
Like, well, at least now we know.
At least we know one.
But
we know you.
And to follow what Edgard said, I think we decided to try to do something, especially when we started, but then it became more something in the background and we didn't really think about it specifically, but something that at least we would be happy with. So that, like when my idea is when you offer a gift, of course, sometimes you're going to offer something that is not your taste at all. But still, you have to have some kind of connection with what you offer. And I think especially at the beginning, we were sensitive to like not knowing at all who would listen to us. And thought, okay, let's try something we are comfortable with, at least an audience like us. And I guess it spread a little bit, but we have no idea. We don't know how people know we exist, and we don't know. Yeah, so we just know some people do listen, and that's fine with us.
Whoever's desire leads them there, leads them to you.
Yeah, and maybe Facebook and Twitter algorithm,
Yeah, that can help too. And maybe we could talk a little bit about what you've seen the difference about psychoanalysis in France versus the States, for example. Because for me, I was training in New York, but it was really through a friend of mine who did her training in France, who lives in New York, and talking to her about a very specific case of someone, and then her like consulting with like colleagues in France and her old supervisor in France, and like really helped me to kind of open my perspective of what was going on in this case, whereas I felt the view that I was getting from my supervisors was so narrow, and like still, even though it was a psychoanalytic institute, was still very like medical model, like mental health medical model, US kind of structures of like diagnosis, and it really wasn't helping me. And really through her eyes and like her kind of consulting with me on this case just totally opened my eyes to that perspective. And then I ended up leaving the institute that I was at and training with the Lacanians instead.
Well, there are other schools in psychoanalysis than the Lacanian in France. It's true that it has a big influence, but that's not all there is. What I mean, I can't really articulate everything that felt different, but let me give you examples as they come up. I would say, and that's something we've been trying to do in discussions on psychoanalysis a lot, is my experience of psychoanalysis in France is that it's a lot more inclusive. There's no debate, I think, in France around the question of whether or not you should include social considerations into your practice. No, I don't remember any debate around that. There might be in some obscure orthodox groups, but not at all where the world around me back then. While in the US, it seems like even if intellectually some people understand that if you're poor, if you're wealthy, if you're this or that, then you will have a different approach to the world. Still, it seems like as you said, and what I hear is there's some kind of a medical understanding of psychoanalysis come through as a legitimate discourse. And then you have this tendency, and I insist again, connected to an intellectual understanding of the importance of including other perspective, you still have then a tendency of bringing forcefully and the psychoanalytic theory as a standalone, and apply that abruptly to your patients. And then at the same time, I am really insisting, because you will have social consideration. I insist because this split, as I would refer to a split, might not be technically exact, but this split was very disturbing to me, because I could hear people saying one thing and then the second later use their position as psychoanalysts and their knowledge as psychoanalysts in a way that did not include what I just mentioned before. And so that in France really was, we didn't have that. Also, I was, I think, lucky enough to be trained in France in a university, meaning that I was taught by people who were paid a sufficiently good enough salary to teach and to learn and to train for us. And so they could bring digested knowledge like I experienced. I didn't really have, except maybe 2 or 3 instructors in the US. In the US, you could really feel like the psychoanalysis is a narrow field where people struggle to keep it alive. So you work in your own practice during the day, then you go teach for a miserable salary or a stipend to people who are tired at night. And then you don't have the energy, you don't have the time, you don't have the income to say, okay, I have 2 months off now. I'm going to rush and I'm going to go deep into Ferenczi and try to understand him and try to have discussions. You don't have time for that. And I think that has an influence in the way psychoanalysis is taught, in the sense that it becomes the burden of complexity is pushed towards the students. While when I was in France, you would still need to read the authors, you would still need to go deep into the understanding of what was happening, what the author tried to share. But you would have a professor really digest, compare, bring back, position things in a timeline, compare them with different authors in a subtle way. That I think I miss completely. And the last thing that comes to my mind is that in France, even if psychoanalysis is disputed, is attacked, and has been attacked and is still attacked, it is a lot less so than in the US. In France, if you listen to some public intellectual radio, you will often hear a psychoanalyst who will talk about whatever happening from psychoanalytic perspective. Whether it's relevant or not is a different question. But the fact that the talk makes psychoanalysis relevant, and you can practice psychoanalysis in a lot of different frames. In France, I did very little, therapy. therapy, like one-on-one therapy. Most of my work was institutional work. I would have what we call residents. It's not medical resident, but residents, and you work in a facility. So you do some workshop. Then I was also training so as a psychologist, I was a bit higher on the authority like hierarchy. So one of my goals was to train the people who directly work with the residents. I personally like to work with residents, so I would do that. It's not every psychologist do it, and so I would have a direct practice. I would supervise them. I would also engage into thinking about how the institute function, like the rules of it. And so all those things create a very different approach, I believe, to psychoanalysis that seems in the US. I know there are some places where they try to do that. I can't remember the name right now, but in the US, it's pretty much one-on-one, or I mean, it's always mostly in an office, and people seemed unable to imagine how different it could be and what it means to use psychoanalysis elsewhere. And then I'm going to stop on that subject. But when I was training at NPAP, at some point I became MITO chair, meaning that I was the head of the group that represents the students, the candidates or members in training, as sometimes we said at NPAP. And I was struck by the fact that members were not really applying psychoanalytic principle, not in terms of treatment, but in terms of moral ideas, to the way candidates were treated. And to me, it's a nonsense. If you work in an institute, especially in psychoanalytic institutes, but anywhere, you should not analyze people, but you should have in mind some of the psychoanalytic principles, some of the psychoanalytic values, if we can talk about it this way, and apply them very simply, like treat people with respect, be aware of the power dynamics, be aware of potential transference. Don't weaponize them, but be aware of them. Be aware of possible demands that can be unspoken. Don't weaponize them again, but be aware of them. And that seemed like people, and I think it's still, I'm pretty sure it's still the case. They don't really have the imagination or maybe the availability to apply it to the structure. So, yeah.
Did you want to say something, Edgard?
Just to, in terms of comparison and contrast, I grew up in a place where psychoanalysis is not part of the, it's unheard of. Psychoanalysis in Puerto Rico. Most of the therapies are conducted by psychologists, but they are trained as in behavioral theories and methodologies. But I had at some point in my life back in Puerto Rico, I had the great opportunity of being in treatment with psychoanalysts. One of the few in the island who had trained in New York. So that was my encounter with psychoanalysis. So just to distinction here, in some Latin American countries, there's a tradition, a psychoanalytic tradition. Where I come from, that is not the case. In fact, mental health services, therapy, psychotherapy in general is seen as alien and something that says more about weakness than anything else. So people don't go to therapy. So my experience compared to Grégoire was completely different. So I come to live in New York. And then I'm impacted by the ways that psychoanalysis, compared to my experience in Puerto Rico, New York City was quite a place where you could engage with a lot of people. And there are institutes, and I thought that was fascinating. So certainly, you can see quite a difference between Grégoire and myself in terms of how we see, or the lens we use to see psychoanalysis in the United States. I come from a place of deficiency, meaning that it's unheard to talk about psychoanalysis in Puerto Rico. I come to New York, where there are still some traditions in place. Yeah.
Yeah, New York is very rich for psychoanalysis in the U.S. I didn't appreciate it enough until I came here, and there's a Swedish Psychoanalytic Institute, and there are some Lacanian psychoanalysts in Gothenburg, which is like a town like 3 hours away from the capital. So there are some analysts, but it's not like really accepted by the culture, and it's they're very kind of rare. Yeah, I had mistakenly thought that it was very psychoanalytic, but that's because I was basing my idea of Sweden on my husband, and my husband was in analysis for 4.5 years, 5 days a week. He did like the real like 5 day a week Freudian analysis. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to a place where everyone loves psychoanalysis. But that's not the case anymore. And even though it wasn't that, I think he did his in like 2004 to 2008. So it wasn't that long ago. But in that period of time, it's like really shifted. And the only way you can really see an analyst, at least, all their medical care is through the government. And you can see an analyst private pay, of course. But the only way you can see someone like through their mental health care is if they're a psychiatrist. Then the psychiatrist can like prescribe psychoanalytic treatment.
Maybe in France, there's a distinction that I don't make that is maybe important for a U.S. American audience, is that psychoanalysis is mostly practiced by psychologists. So if you go see someone and if you go see a psychoanalyst per se, then it's going to be out of pocket. But if you go to some specific public institute and you see a psychologist, most likely they will have been trained in psychoanalysis, and you will receive a psychoanalytic therapy, not a psychoanalysis as your husband received, but something with where people listen to the unconscious and everything that comes with it.
That's great. And when I started training, I'm from Miami originally. I went to grad school down there. And when I went to grad school for psychology, I had assumed that everyone was kind of trained analytically, which was not the case. But that's what I had thought going in. And then I was like, where's Freud? He's not there anymore.
It's a good question after.
Where's Freud?
But it's really great to hear, though, that the psychologists are trained analytically, and also like you said, in more clinics, because that was the case with the certain case I was talking about that I brought to a friend. Was in a hospital. I was working in a hospital, and a place where you definitely wouldn't find psychoanalytic thinking. And I really needed the psychoanalytic thinking to work with him, even though we were in a hospital setting, and my supervisor was basically like, no, you can't do that. Like, you have to just have him fill out this paperwork and, mark the happy faces of like 0 to 10 and all that kind of thing. And I just really can't treat adults that way. I can't sit with an adult and have them like fill out these forms of like how happy or sad they are and these kinds of things. I mean, it's like so infantilizing.
Yes, it is. And I guess it's the question of treat is then in question. Is that is it really treating people, or is it more like some kind of managerial dimension where you just you deal with the symptoms and you move on? You don't. I mean, that happens. I have to say, I was describing a very beautiful picture of France. It happens in France too. No problem about that. It's not a perfect place.
But they do have, I met through Manya. I'm talking about Manya Steinkohler is the person I was talking to. And I met through Manya, Guy Dana, who like really worked with people in like hospital settings and like set up a different way of like residential treatment where people had a lot more freedom to like move within the buildings and the structures, even though they were like living in this area.
Mm.
Yeah, well, you try to create life, to create desire, to reanimate that. It doesn't have to be the desire in the Lacan term, but something where people become subject of themselves and not just tools that have to go one place and then the other and show society that they are well functioning. But that requires so much more work, and you do need institutional support. You can't just do that by yourself in your office. That's for sure.
So how did you all become interested in psychoanalysis in the first place?
Oh,
Edgard,
well, in my case, I come from the natural sciences, and I was trained as a chemist, and
only
taught.
Trained. Oh yeah, okay,
Well,
go ahead.
and taught chemistry at the University of Puerto Rico for about 16 years or so. So I was very much grounded in the order and the mechanics of natural sciences until, of course, as it happens, life happens, and and then I thought that my the security I had needed to be deconstructed and needed to explore exactly what I wanted in my life, and I went to psychotherapy with as I mentioned, with the fantastic coincidence that the psychotherapist that I was referred by a friend was a psychoanalyst. And the interesting thing is that he was a psychoanalyst, and yet he was a professor of psychology at the University of Puerto Rico. So, of course, a minority within the psychology department at the university, but still a very, I wouldn't say a classical Freudian, but a somewhat Freudian, whatever the somewhat is. And that was my first encounter with psychoanalysis, and it was very rich. It was very it was a life changing experience, and it allowed me to name what was unnamed at that point for me, and it also created a deep curiosity about my inner world and inner world of other people. So little by little, transition to a less mechanic perspective of the world and of people, meaning I moved away from the natural sciences. I went through theology, began to study the humanities, philosophy, theology. I decided to get out of the island, moved to New York City, and then I began to train as a psychoanalyst. So on the surface, it was because my world began to shift, and I needed to find a way to understand myself and understand the world I was living in. So that's what brought me to psychotherapy and to psychoanalysis. Yeah.
I love it. I love hearing people's journeys. They're all so different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on my side, how did that happen? I mean, I'm going to start with the fact that, as I think Edgard was indicating, it's a journey that starts probably way before we know it starts. And things eventually take shape, and we resonate with some occasions that are brought to us by life around us. So for me, after I finished high school, I went to law school So in France, when you finish high school, you directly go to university and you specialized right away, at least back then. I think now it's slightly different, but still. So I went to law school for 4 years, and I didn't like it. I struggled a lot. I was studying a lot, and I never really got into it. I mean, I guess I was upset by the inconsistency of law and how things change, because someone say, "Oh no, we understand this word this way." Oh man, I was so tired of it. And I had also undergone therapy with a psychiatrist. I think the last year or the last 2 years, being in law school. And I had my best friend had moved from a university where he studied philosophy to a university where he studied to become a psychologist, and to learn where he learned psychoanalysis. And he mentioned that to me a few times, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but can you make a living of that? And my head, of course, the answer was no. So I didn't want to pursue that, and I thought, okay, so good for him, and I'm going to stay in law, because in law my life is more secure, etc. Even if it didn't make any sense, and eventually it made so little sense that I decided to stop law and to go to sociology. And when the shift happened at one specific moment. I went to register, and I brought the forms, and the person at the administration told me, "Oh, I know you are legally, we are legally bound to allow you in sociology because you have your degree in law. But just so you know, there are so many of you that we're gonna have to. Probably it's gonna be harder to stay the following years." Well, I guess I don't even know if I think I took my forms back and I left. And I thought, this is too fucked up. I spent 4 years of my life working, studying like crazy, something I didn't like. I don't want to go to something I like where there will be artificial pressure, because for administrative reasons, they don't have enough room for the students who applied. And at the same time, my friend, who was learning psychoanalysis, lent me introductions to psychoanalysis from Freud. And so it was summertime. Well, I read a lot of it, and I kept thinking, man, that's it. That's wonderful. That makes sense. That's interesting. It's intellectually stimulating. And so I applied to very late to be a student in psychology, and I got accepted. And this is how it started.
Wonderful! I love it. And how did you two meet?
We met in our institute.
We met in the class Edgard was referring to at the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah.
The dream. Was it dream? Yeah, it was.
It was dream. Yeah, dream interpretation class.
Wonderful.
And the four of us. There were other candidates in the class.
Why did we talk to each other?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Well, I don't remember
what I had. But so I don't recall. I cannot recall what brought us together, except that probably our accents were different, and we somehow connected to each other. I don't know. I don't recall. I don't remember. Yeah, but that's how we met.
Yeah, I remember you. You know, so I had been in the US for a year, and Edgar and another member in training mentioned something about them being look like as brown or Spanish or no, whatever, not white. And I have to say, I'm still not very. I'm still disconnected from the way Americans see race and company. But anyway, and I remember telling Edgar and this other woman, like, but no, look at you. You're just as white as me. And Edgar turned toward me angrily, not in the US. and the other girl said, yeah, this country is fucked up. And which I agree with and still do. And I think, I guess then probably we had a sense that we didn't fit completely the expectations. Probably Tina and Peter also. For whatever reason, I think you guys came to me and asked, and I was like, oh, sure. I'm happy to have friends. Please come in. Because at that time I was very isolated in the US. I didn't know anyone. And I think I appreciate, at least I was sensitive to how the three of them were critical. Like I don't feel safe with people who are too eager to please, eager to agree with the master. I feel safer with people who are complaining, who see when something is off or something is said but not acted on. Then I feel safer, and I think I felt that with the three of them.
It's intriguing. I don't recall the me. Well,
I
me
still
responding
see you,
to
Edgar.
you with
I
anger,
see your
but
face.
yeah, of course, and when you say it, it makes even if I don't remember the specific moment, yeah, that sounds like me.
Yeah.
It does sound
you
like
were not
me.
happy.
And
for what reasons?
Yeah. So that's how we met, and
and I guess we stuck together through meeting regularly, at people's house, and
so we would meet up usually on a monthly basis, sometimes more often. We would have a meal together, and then we would talk about the training. We would complain. We would dream. We would commiserate with each other. We also would share clinical material with each other, listen to how the other hears the material. So it has been quite a rich experience. Yeah.
Yes, that's how it happened.
And it allowed us not to feel isolated. I mean, because
and probably protected from some of the craziness of the institute.
Oh, yeah, as well. Yes.
I mean, craziness.
It's a very lonesome profession. You are in your office. Well, the three of us right now are in different offices, not in the same office, and we are doing this across the ocean. But then here, when we are practicing, it can be a lonesome experience. And I think having these colleagues that were and are critical of the training of society. We use different lenses to see the world, both the inner world and the external world, and that has allowed us to be better clinicians. Let me put it my own experience. It has allowed me to be a better clinician. The experience of meeting Grégoire and Tina and Peter. Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
It did for all of us. Yeah, we were able to, as much as we could, but to feel safe and to be critical towards the institute or other things, but also toward ourselves, and still know that we could speak freely and feel safe about whatever difficulties we had and some of the preconception we had, and work on it. And Tina comes from Germany. She studied psychology there too, sociology also, I think. Peter also had a law degree, and he was a lawyer before, and copyright, I think, something like that. And so we all came with very, I would say, established life before, and we could then feed that into our reflections and into our discussions.
Yeah.
That's and I think we liked it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point as well. Not just different cultures, but you all had these kind of different careers before, and then all coming to psychoanalysis and bringing all of that into the mix.
Yeah.
That's really great. Well, I'm really glad you did, and I'm glad you have your podcast. And I can say, I mean, just since I'm thinking of my training, I started training in 2010, and I'm thinking, I wish I had these podcasts and these things that we're doing and that other people are doing then, because even though that was only 11 years ago, it was like, I feel like for me, it was like in a psychoanalytic desert, you know. It's like, I didn't know we were allowed to question the institute, you know. I was like very much in this like authoritarian structure there, and I feel like it seems to have bloomed so much since then.
Well, you know, I think my if I owe something to my to spending some years in law school, is that I really learn how symbolic power is. It's a bunch of words. It's rules. It's you have rules in a game. You have the Constitution, and then you have more specific. But it's all determined by human beings. There's nothing that is. I mean, some people might believe it comes from a divine entity. Well, it's not I don't share that idea. And so, to me, I don't. When an authority doesn't seem legitimate to me, I feel very safe feeling so and expressing it. And I think law really helped me on that, to see how ridiculous sometimes it is to say, oh, but the law said that, or the law. Oh yeah, but rewrite the law if the law is not good, rewrite it. I mean, really, it's not something that has to stay forever. And, But yeah, the podcast and all the videos today, it's such a different field than it was 10, 11 years ago. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I could have a whole hour just complaining about the institutes. Maybe one day. I recently had like a panel where I had Sheldon George and Derek Hook, Michelle Stevens and Sheila Kavanaugh. They talked about a book that Sheldon and Derek edited, and then Michelle and Sheila had contributed to, and had kind of like a group discussion. And then I thought maybe I should start having like topics and like inviting multiple people in to talk about like different topics, like the institutes or like different things in the field. That could be really fun as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, you might not want to unleash too much anger, so you need people who will feel can contain it.
Yeah. Well, just to let the people that are training now know that there are options. There are options in many ways towards being a psychoanalyst, and many different theories and many different ways to do it.
I mean, I believe that.
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Edgard.
Just to mention this about the rules and the laws. You know, the one of the challenges now, at least in New York State, is that we are under the law, meaning our profession is licensed, and in what ways we have gained, or in what ways we have lost, and of course, in both ways, something has been gained, something has been lost. But then again, when an institute says, "Oh, but this is what the state requires," then how are we minimizing the potential of psychoanalysis by creating this kind of discourse where the state dictates?
But that may be your American perception. Coming from France,
go ahead.
Where the state is not necessarily. I mean, lately with Macron and others might have changed, but as an enemy, I feel like the question of the state requirements are not necessarily an issue per se. I studied in a university where there was state requirements, but the state, when the state only says, well, you should teach them this or that, That's one thing. They don't necessarily ask you how to teach it. And I feel like that's where the space is. And so in the question of whether or not we lost with licensing, my sense is in the US, we didn't lose anything because the psychoanalysis doesn't have enough strength to survive by itself. And licensing allows us to be available to a lot more people. And that's how it spread. And if you want to, the institutes then are really completely free to use whatever title the class is to teach what they want. And the state is not going to look at how every class is happening. Of course, you should follow something because people need to know a certain amount of things and to be aware of a certain amount of things to practice safely for them and for their patients. But within the class, I mean, you can be very free in the way you teach it. That I think is because, again, of what I mentioned earlier, I think there is a lack often, not always, of available space because people are tired. And then I think that is more problematic. The lack of funding to me is more problematic than the intervention of the state to say, because if you look at currently what they're asking us to teach, actually, let's remember that it is because of New York State that now Psychoanalytic Institute have to include the social in their teaching.
True. Yeah. I think, again, coming from a different background, while I was professor at the university, and then a dean also, then I had to navigate licensing and requirements of external entities that would impose on the university a certain structure. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay.
And in that sense, it will constrain and constrict the capacity of the university to be a place where we can be more creative. And so how do you balance creative forces with an external entity, such as an agency that is saying, we will accredit you or not, we will your master's, your doctoral degrees are accredited or not. How do you balance these two things? And it's a difficult and political, I would say, process. How to balance these two becomes a political process. So I think it happens also with psychoanalysis in New York State. And I don't want to lose that the capacity to be creative within the constraints of the state. How do we do that? Do we have to do it? Those are the fundamental questions.
Yes, as an instructor, you would have to. Yeah.
Yes.
So that reminds me that going back to the very beginning of the podcast is that a big difference in the training in France is that we are not only taught psychoanalysis for adults and functioning adults. I was very struck by the fact that in the US, you had to go to a very specific place to be taught for children, adolescents, and also for all people. And I think this is a very big issue because when you are working with an adult, you are working with their past and you are working with their expected future. And if you have no idea how a child or a teenager function, it doesn't mean that you won't be able to work with those people, with adults, but you will miss. You will miss some aspect of how it's to connect the psychical dynamic with a certain memory. Because when adults remember the childhood, of course, it's transformed by their adulthood, but it does come from a place where the psychical equilibrium was not the same, where the importance of projection and identification with parental figures was completely different. And I felt that the fact that in the classes they did not include some reflection, some idea, some clues about, okay, so this is for adults, but hey, guys, keep in mind that maybe for children, you have this and that. I think that was really missing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good point. Well, we only have a few minutes, and I know you all have to work. Was there anything else you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
Yeah.
I'm good. What about you, Grégoire?
Well, I could mention something. I don't know how relevant it is, but I find doing the podcast, I found it interesting to see the disconnection between the listeners and the investment. Meaning, we early in the life of the podcast, we did 2 podcasts on the Japanese comics. And some of my thoughts around somehow some specific Japanese comics could be, because of their structure, helpful to teenagers to become adults. Those podcasts are the least listened to, yet they created the most reaction, with people writing to us, commenting, etc. And well, just to point out that it is, as we said, we don't really know who our audience is. I still am a bit clueless regarding how internet works in those area. Why do people do that? Why do people listen? I mean, we have one where we have a lot of listeners, and nobody wrote to us at all. And I don't really understand the group, or the group dynamic among the listeners. So that's also one of the reasons why when we record podcast, when we decide on theme, we just do what we think we would like to hear first, because we don't understand this mass that's listening to us sometime. That's what I want.
Yeah, well, I think that's perfect. Just do what you want to hear, and then whoever listens. That's the best thing to do. Not to worry about the audience. That's the best artists do that. They just make what they make, and they don't worry about the audience.
My good. That's what I wanted to hear.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you,
Thank you for the invitation. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Grégoire Pierre and Edgard Danielsen. Be sure to check out their websites and follow their podcast, Discussions on Psychoanalysis, streaming at podcast platforms everywhere. You can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, or the podcast main website, renderingunconscious.org, for links and more information. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. And now a track from the album Lunacy, the original soundtrack to the film of the same name, created by Carl Abrahamson and myself. You can listen to the soundtrack at our Bandcamp, Vanessa Sinclair, carlabrahamson.bandcamp.com. And you can view the film on our Vimeo. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Enjoy. Reproduction and your mind. Your something is the hurt. energies through the pages or montage. Dearest Vanessa, the car a craft, and not waiting here too, if you'd only get to know him. Just been in contact with, in wretched, my heart is. Also, please add, gazing upon it with a sense of dread. This is mad. Print down stale streets, blood sickle, honey suck of the noon rush, absolute weak. Ism for you of has collapsed. Sense for snakes, over the moon and back again. Words have the vitality of, to the true soul, after thee. If your head explodes with dark forebodings too, I'll see you on the dark side of the moon. Pink, Das Unbehagen of, classic, more power than power. My fur for you, ability to not only, both more than two bodies, some creativity. Next stop, find another name that, and cripples the demon, and joins. Didn't manifest itself. It isn't easy being human. Although we live longer and are helped along by technology, and along with, and most recently, pharmaceuticals, we have no guarantee for either happiness or understanding of ourselves during a ranger and his while I'm making a mirror, something to see myself in. Where to look for guidance and insight? Well, there are Lifestyle of a Wife and 2. Freud stated that we are ways to go, in and out. Being introspective can certainly bring insights, but most often only for David Bowie. Like a flash, touching upon the individual sphere. If we, instead, look outside and far away, we can see, yes, homage. The living to what exactly? Up? That's the task of thee, work things out. And they didn't even have to. Man, am I that? Resources to supplement formal training with what they fear most. By a heart of stone. You, of many books, where shame is chiseled. When the sun sets, we are wrapped in darkness and despair. Space is empty, black, enormous, almost invisible. His life containing a myriad of tiny, tiny starlights, and allegedly filled with devouring black holes, came to experiments, threatening asteroids and aliens. Although, ass up, blocking things we can't direct. Her very patient, devastated he, drawing of the Renaissance and our senses. We are still sensory driven more than anything else. Always have been. A new form of fire and fear. When the sun rises, the senses are alerted. We can see what's tangible, have never, as I think, at all understood thee. When I worry, the message is lost in sweet note. Processes. Most of us structure our active lives based, and then, visibility of the sun, and then retract when it's no longer visible. One could say this is new simplifications. Want natural, in the sense natural for optimal utilitarian use of the waking state. Mirrors, unbearable. These above landscapes so wild. Employed I recall vividly, in search of a place to call home. Them was very special, but of course there is light also at night. Usual, all our own artificial, integrate themselves of this building, lights. But the fact spliced texts that are, were provides primordial comfort. The moon reflecting the sun, works and, that is currently gangster elsewhere, has been the true guiding light for humans all along history. Displayed, inducted, apparently in the middle, or due. Doors open and close, eclipses we may claim to be fascinated by a phenomenon in sky, but in deemed actual fact, we're instinctually terrified. Use will and self-discipline when I would in, I'm making, the body. And know that the dead desert, changing sound of the recording, work with it until it sounds differently, that we could not afford to know him. The sun affects us by heat, rebirth cycles, it direct, tangible ways. We take the sun for granted and at the same, adapt our lives and cultures around it. Energy embodies the moon, affects us by reflected light and timelessness and purity. Relish magnetic force, quite a different story. Let me know what life, but the moon regulates it, and see, exposing ourselves, began saging thee, thereby controls human destiny to a greater and more tangible extent. Me who brought thee, the future will know their own kind. Embellish human existence, but convention forbids. Body corresponds to thee, present throughout. Innumerable form of the occulted, tissue that structures, binds, and supports.